Just before our panellists take to the stage, we wanted to have a quick chat with the head of communications at the AHRC, Philip Pothen, who's going to give us a bit of an overview of the debate series as a whole and what we're hoping to hear this evening. So, welcome, Philip. So, I had some questions for you. So, can you tell us a bit about the Way We Live Now debate series?
Well, it's our 10th anniversary this year, and we thought what better way of marking that than by bringing the arts and humanities to bear on some of the really important questions that we're facing about the way we live, the world around us, how the world is changing. And so it's a way of kind of both reflecting on the past, how we've got to where we are, but also looking forward very much to the future and the challenges of the future.
Fantastic. So why did you choose this out of a range? I understand people applied to run debates and you whittled it down to just a few. How did you choose the Curating the Nation one?
It was a very, very good proposal, very strong idea about curation, and that's a really important aspect of the way we live now in terms of museums and galleries being really important in as ways of interpreting our history and our culture and so on. So that was the first thing. I mean, the other thing as well is it's the independent research organisations who are organising this tonight. Amongst them, some major cultural organisations such as, of course, the British Museum, Imperial War Museum, the Tate, and V&A, and so on. And it's also the 10th anniversary of independent research organisation status. So it's a way of marking that, and so those two things I think were really strong and powerful.
Fantastic. And what other topics are we going to look forward to in the series going forward?
We've got 10 debates over the next 9 months, and the topics are very wide-ranging, from the book, the city, the nation, the digital, asking questions such as, is British culture a myth? Asking questions around the machine world. How do we feel about machines, computers, increasingly making decisions about us? In terms of health, education, transport, and so on. So there's a whole range of different topics coming to play, and it's a very exciting proposition, I think.
Fantastic. And what are you hoping to see discussed this evening or to result from the discussion that we'll have tonight?
Well, I'm hoping we'll get a really interesting set of questions, and I think some really provocative presentations from the speakers. I'm hoping that people, a remote audience, will also ask some searching questions. We also got an essay competition for doctoral students to write essays on the topics of these 10 debates. So I'm hoping that it won't just be about tonight, it will be about reflection and writing and discussing in the future as well.
Fantastic. And just to put you on the spot again, what other things can people look out for as part of the 10th anniversary celebrations?
Our Research in Film Awards, that's a really exciting new departure for us. The essay competition I've mentioned. And we're putting together a lot of, keep an eye on our website, I would suggest, because a lot of feature articles, films and so on, trying to capture what the arts and research community has managed to do over the last 10 years.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I will let you go and take your seat because I think we're going to start in about 5 minutes. So thank you very much indeed.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the British Museum this evening and to this discussion on the way we live now, marking the 10th anniversary of the AHRC's establishment of IROs, or as we used to call them, analog bodies. It was one of the startling developments of the mid-2000s that as everybody else appeared to be going digital, we decided to go analog. And the result was, of course, remarkable. It has, I think, changed the way we think about research in our institutions, and it does, I think, bring us back to the very beginning of why our national collections exist. When this museum was created by Parliament in the mid-1750s, it was a remarkable new departure. There was no national museum anywhere. Parliament had the opportunity to take over an existing collection that had been used by scholars, and it decided to create a new kind of public institution owned by trustees so that the Crown would not be able to control the intellectual life that took place in the museum, that critical distance from power that they wanted to ensure could be maintained. And it was the first institution that they called British. Not because, of course, the collection was about Britain. At that stage, it was even less so than that is the case now. But because it was to be a collection for the citizen to use and not for the Crown to deploy. I think that's quite important for this evening's debate, because the purpose of the museum being set up was very clear in the parliamentary debates. It was for all curious and studious persons, and it was to be open free to those people, native and foreign. So from the beginning, the idea of free access from the whole world to a collection embracing the whole world lies at the heart of what our public collections are. And the other reason that I think it's so appropriate to this evening's debate is that the reason that Parliament felt it had to do this was because London, the largest city in Europe in the 1750s, the richest city in Europe in the 1750s, was the only city of its scale that didn't have a university. Oxford and Cambridge vetoed every attempt to have another university. And in a sense, the museum was conceived as an open university for anybody to carry out research as they chose. The return to that in the creation of analog status and now the IROs was, I think, a very significant return to the prime purpose, but also it's enabled all of us, I think, to rethink our research priorities. And I think it's fair to say that in every public collection that has IRO status, the volume of research has greatly increased. And certainly we now construct our long-term 5-year plans very much on the basis of our research in the context of the AHRC framework and working with other IROs in the consortium. What a national collection now means, when of course it's a collection of objects from all over the world, is of great public interest and great public debate. How that collection, the national collection, wherever held, should be made available, how above all it should be increased and developed, is a really difficult subject. And it's the subject that is going to be discussed by our panel tonight. And I'd like to ask Rebecca Bailey, who's the Head of Education and Outreach at the Royal Commission on Ancient Historical Monuments in Scotland, now to take over the evening. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil, for that great introduction. This evening, we're going to hear from a rich panel of speakers, all of whom devote their professional lives to the topic of tonight's debate, Curating the Nation. Each of them is going to give an introduction to themselves and their work, and then share with you a few thoughts on why they collect, what they collect, and who they collect for. The order of play tonight is going to be, first up will be Nick Merriman, Director of Manchester Museum. They've very cleverly sat in order to help you here. Second will be Richard Price, Head of Contemporary British Collections at the British Library. Third, we have Hilary Roberts, Research Curator of Photography at the Imperial War Museum. And last, but definitely not least, we have Kieran Long, Keeper of Design, Architecture and Digital at the Victoria and Albert Museum. I think a set of biographies is available, so I'm not going to tell you any more about them, because anyway, they're going to tell you some of that themselves. Some of the themes and questions we're hoping to tackle this evening include, is everyone a curator these days? Who influences our collecting choices? How will we be judged on those choices? Can you have culture without tourism? What do we mean by curating the nation? We'll also be talking about the challenges of collecting the ephemeral and the digital, issues of globalization and nationhood, and we'll be putting the museum in direct dialogue with the wider public realm. It seems only fair, given that I've asked each of them to share with you some of their personal stories, that I should start by doing the same. As a student of architectural history at the University of Edinburgh, I spent time volunteering and working for the National Monuments Record of Scotland. A highlight of that experience, which I've never forgotten, guaranteed to ignite my interest in collections, was being able to catalogue a volume of Robert Adams' exquisite travel sketches. My first job on graduating was to undertake a comprehensive survey of Scottish architects' papers in public and private hands from the period up to 1950. For 4 years, I had the best job in the world. I travelled the length and breadth of Scotland, discovering, recording, and in many cases collecting the drawings and manuscripts of Scotland's architects. In addition to an early mobile phone the size of a small house, I never travelled without acid-free boxes and a huge yellow transit portfolio. My remit was to identify and ensure a safe future for everything that survived, regardless of whether it was a post-war design for a cowshed or 19th century country house adaptations. I was interested in the complete picture of how Scotland was designed and built in the 19th and 20th centuries, from the elite to the everyday. When I presented my work as a bright young, whatever I was, 22-year-old, to my peers in the International Confederation of Architectural Museums, there was a little bit of scepticism as to whether such a mission was either sensible or desirable. 20 years later, I was elected president of the International Confederation, and I'm still subject to a little bit of teasing for my youthful naivety and optimism. Though now, of course, the debates we have are all about how to save the digital. But without that naivety and optimism, the record of the buildings in which Scots lived, worked, and played would have been lost. The many urban and rural conservation projects that have done so much to bring our everyday historic environment back to life would have been poorly informed and less rooted in historical evidence. The community engagement projects we now regularly support would not have the same richness of evidence to fuel their work. Happily, as my early collecting work wound down, the work of the Heritage Lottery Fund got underway, and we were awarded substantial funding to stabilise and make accessible the many, many van loads of drawings and manuscripts that I'd collected. Since those early days, I've moved away from invading the nation's attics and basements and have turned instead to the applied use of our collections. As head of education and outreach, I work to share our archive through formal education resources, community engagement, exhibitions and publications, and also, of course, by encouraging and facilitating its use in research. But that's quite enough about me. I'm now going to hand over to the panel. And first up, we have Nick.
Good evening. My interest in objects and collecting was fired, first of all, by trailing around junk shops in Birmingham with my father, who, as well as being a quantity surveyor, was very keen on antiques or converting junk into saleable antiques. And I sort of copied him by getting very interested in collecting bottles and then digging in bottle dumps and finding stuff, and realised that I loved finding stuff from the past. So naturally, I became an archaeologist because that was a sort of means of carrying on digging. But then actually, I got very interested in what all of this archaeological work meant, how we could say things about people in the past and societies past and present. So I got very interested then in museums and how museums can sort of act as means of public engagement in collections generally. And my PhD ended up being on looking at why large sections of the population actually didn't or don't visit museums. And when I started my career at the Museum of London, I became really interested in gaps in representation in the collections. At the time I was there, the galleries finished at the Second World War. So any communities that had moved to London, particularly from overseas since that time in the post-war period, simply didn't see themselves represented in the galleries or in the collections. So I developed a project in the early 1990s called The Peopling of London, which began to collect on the theme of overseas migration for the first time. And I was very influenced by the people in the modern department. I was sort of in an archaeological department. The modern department there had a keeper, Colin Sorensen, who wasn't an object person at all, and he recruited, alongside object curators, specialists in oral history, ephemera, photography, and that's it, so an oral history, photography, and ephemera. So moving to a university context at UCL and teaching museum studies, I became really interested in anthropological work around memory and forgetting, and relating this to collections in memory institutions such as museums and archives. And as part of the CLAW leadership program I did, I had an opportunity to explore this further with the AHRC-funded research project, which was part of the program. I looked at notions of sustainability in relation to disposal of museum collections, drawing on work from a range of disciplines, including neurobiology. I concluded that in order for human memories to function effectively, people need to forget much of what they experience, and that becomes easier as you get older. And by analogy, forgetting was an important part of the role of memory institutions. In relation to collections, though, I felt that we act as if every item, every memory, if you will, in the collective memory of the nation in its collections, is equally important, and it's inviolable and permanent. And as a result, I argued in my research project, we often find a system in these memory institutions that has got clogged up, and actually it's not functioning effectively, as so much resource is taken up with managing the collections themselves. So I argued then that we should accept that not all objects and items are equally important, that we should accept that what is collected is a reflection of the times it is collected in, and therefore begin to use disposal more actively as a means of managing collections and freeing the memory up, the collective memory. More recently, moving out of London and working in Manchester Museum, part of the University of Manchester, for the last 9 years, I've become interested in collecting, again, rather than disposal, particularly in relation to the large disciplinary-based museums of natural history and human cultures, like the Manchester Museum. Here, the collections were amassed, not to say anything about Manchester or about the nation, but ultimately about the world and Manchester's relation to it at a time of its dominance as an industrial city. The heyday of collecting in Manchester was over the century from about 1850 to 1950, and actually relatively little has been collected since then for all sorts of reasons. But rather than have the museum remain as a time capsule of imperial expansion, I wanted us to challenge ourselves as to what collecting would look like in a post-colonial world. The first thing we needed to think about was the paradigm of collecting. The 19th century and early 20th century one was, of course, driven by concepts of biological and cultural evolution and of the systematics that underpin the identification of change and progress. Hence, we get types and classes and species and so on. However, when we look at the history of collections, we see that they were actually shaped by the passions and rivalries of particular collectors. What seem on the surface rational and systematic collections are in fact irrational expressions of individual passions and completely partial and subjective. So in our contemporary context, when ideas of objectivity and encyclopedic collecting are dismissed as unattainable, it's reassuring that we can also see that this was the case with our Victorian and later predecessors, and therefore that a future collecting paradigm should accept and embrace the partiality and subjectivity of collecting. And I realise there are different disciplines of collecting, this is not an issue in many areas. So we began to think of collecting as an interpretation of the world rather than a record of it, with the implication that judgment and an understanding of social context is fundamental. The second thing we needed to think about was how to integrate collecting with other areas of museum activity. And in many museums, collecting has traditionally been led by the interests of each discipline, with the peer group as the main reference. And it's been a kind of subsurface activity within the museum, carried on unrelated to most other museum programs that are going on. Given that we accepted collecting as an interpreted activity, we began to think about ways in which collecting could be part of long-term museum programs, exploring particular themes of contemporary relevance. And finally, we began to think about how and what we would collect. Particularly in natural history, there's still a strong notion that collecting is systematic and scientific. And I wanted to challenge this in the light of what I've just said, particularly if we wanted to resume collecting in different parts of the world. And taking my cue from how anthropology has had to rethink collecting, and borrowing a word from the Pitt Rivers Museum, I challenged us to think about all future collecting being relational, in which the specificities of context and the interaction between people is of fundamental significance. And the process of collecting itself becomes highly significant, with one of the major outcomes being the development of relationships between museum staff and members of particular communities. Collecting thus becomes as much about recording images, conversations, and thoughts alongside the collecting of objects and specimens. And as a result, and we'll come back to this many times, digital preservation and distribution become fundamentally important, and museums really have to take seriously a new kind of digital asset management and curation. Some examples might help to illustrate what I mean. In a first pilot project, we looked at the theme of trees, as this was something that linked almost all of our collections. We worked with local communities, recording their attachment to local trees. We did bio-blitzes with local people, looking at what lived in local trees. We documented protests in a local park about the cutting down of particularly valued trees, and of course collected examples of trees and seeds. And this culminated in a small exhibition on the meaning of trees to local people, which included a section asking people about what we should collect in the future. In the evaluation of this pilot, we concluded that we should be focusing actually on broader themes rather than specific physical things. So our current collecting project, just in its infancy, is on the theme of migration. This is clearly a topic of contemporary relevance, but the difference is that we're not a social history museum. So we're looking at it in the light of our existing collections and our existing expertise. Our theme isn't just migration of people, though this looms very large. It's also about the migration of plants and animals and objects. For instance, our botanist is mapping the migration of non-native plants through climate change, while our geologist has looked at rocks for sale in a local market stall from all around the world. Our anthropologist is interviewing recent migrants about their experience and recording objects of significance to them. And in all cases, our curators are being trained in new skills, such as filmmaking and interviewing, and at working in cross-disciplinary teams, and in the curation of digital materials. I think that overall in museums, we're at a critical phase where we're embracing the idea of collecting being a subjective interpretation of the world, and therefore plugged into all other museum programs, at the same time as embracing the possibilities of digital recording in ways that can move museums into a new form of memory institution. Thank you.
My name's Richard Price. I'm the head of Contemporary British Collections at the British Library. I'll talk about contemporary British collections there and widen that out to include what I call macro curatorship. I'll share some of my personal motivations as a researcher myself, as well as a particular kind of librarian. Staff-wise, my department has over 40 curators and other colleagues, and like any curatorial department, relies on many other staff in the organisation and many others beyond the organisation. Contemporary British covers well over 1.5 million UK publications from 2000 onwards, the year 2000 onwards. That's in print and digital format, but it also includes the UK Web Archive, which in our last harvest added 6 million websites to the collection, and that's about 2.5 billion web pages. And we're going to be back next year, and we'll be back the year after that, and so on. That's a collaboration with the other legal deposit libraries in the UK and Ireland. And in a way, it's one of the best snapshots, a very, very collage and big snapshot of UK life. Contemporary British is a cross-media collection. Alongside published works, it collects manuscripts and archives from the 1950s onwards, including politics, publishing, public life, literature, and performance. To take the literary strand, we have the papers of Harold Pinter, Angela Carter, Hanif Qureshi, of Joan Littlewood, and the theatre workshop of Oh, What a Lovely War fame. That's just a few examples. Sometimes they're donations, sometimes we have bought the papers, but either way they're usually here because of years of relationship building by our curators. And because of the rest of the good things, fingers crossed, the library has in general been seen to do. These might be through our schools programme, or in the kind of exhibitions we mount or send our objects to, or our research facilitation in our reading rooms, or in the way that we store and preserve materials, all activities which we hope will reassure the owner that the library is a good place for their works to be. I think the only thing more personal in an archive than handwriting is the sound of the human voice. It's so nearly life itself. In our department, our sound archive dates from the beginnings of commercial recording in the 1870s to the current day. You can hear also the first non-human creature ever recorded. That's a nightingale. And you can hear Florence Nightingale. You can also hear the post-punk band, The Nightingales. It's not organised by the names of birds, by the way. We have well over 6 million sound recordings. They include popular, world and classical music, speech-based performance readings, and we have a multimedia focus on news, radio, TV, web and print, served from a dedicated reading room. The idea of serving, of sharing is important. Collection as a word implies a bringing in and a holding, even a kind of stasis. But curatorship is about movement, about sharing what has been brought in, and of sharing knowledge of what has not been brought in at all, but which exists in other libraries and other institutions. It assumes sharing as widely as condition and rights will allow. As we emphasise in our recent publication, Living Knowledge, this view takes serious cognizance of research imperative, but it goes beyond it, towards other kinds of understanding and pleasure. The British Library, we make our own recordings as well as collecting those made by others, for example in wildlife, theatre and oral history. Our oral history collections typically have a testimonial urgency, interviewing key witnesses to a period of extraordinary change. It could be the English county court system, it could be the history of the oil industry in the UK, it could be the experience of disability. It's only a few projects from the past. Several of our oral history projects have been recipients of AHRC funding. And there are many other areas across the library which have been supported by the Research Council. I'd like to take this moment to acknowledge and thank the AHRC for engaging with contemporary projects so wholeheartedly. To stay just a little longer on the subject of sound, heritage-wise, many of the older items are encoded in formats which are commercially obsolete. They are on the verge of being beyond playback. We've been lucky recently in securing major funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund to help solve this through our programme Save Our Sounds. As well as preserving content most at risk, the programme will reach out to other archives in the UK, strengthening a network which will share and pool expertise and boost that important sense of articulate public celebration. These are obviously vast collections. One of contemporary curatorship's challenges is to make a series of cognitive paths through such huge agglomerations of information and of expression to allow such matted intelligence to be intelligible. In my mind's eye, I see a vast digital forest. It's a peopled version of the temperate rainforest which once covered all these territories, in some places thinly, in some places densely, all before humans set foot here. In this vision, an awe and a melancholy for that certainly departed past is translated into an exhilaration for information and creativity which can now, in some sense, live on at scale into the future. Maybe the role of contemporary British and other curating programmes like it is to keep on asking of that forest, what are you? What is contemporary? What is British? Questions which will offer ways through the great wood and will also find relationships between parts of the forest that could not be understood at smaller scale. I'm looking forward to the library working with a newly founded Alan Turing Institute based with us, looking at new ways of understanding these information ecosystems. Traditional curatorship always chooses, always judges. If the world out there is jam-packed with maybe, curators traditionally risk and accept the responsibility of making some maybes into a yes. This clearly means converting many maybes into no's, excluding as well as including, and this can be an unpopular act. To change my metaphor, curators essentially work for separation of goats from sheep, PLC. The big difference between that selective approach and the essentially big data approach I've described is that many more maybes are brought into the collection in the latter. If you like, with the macro-curator approach, we don't say whether they are goats or sheep, antelope or gazelles. We understand that our current generation may not be able to make that kind of judgment. And we don't want to deprive future generations of the opportunity. We also know that notions of importance are in the eye of the beholder, can alternate and be changed by the act of actively noticing them. They can change over time, back and forth. For these exceptional large collections, we resist discerning goats from sheep and just say, we've secured an awful lot of cloven-hoofed animals in this here corral. Of course, it's not really that simple, and judgment isn't actually suspended. There are still critical and potentially very expensive elements of judgment in this wider kind of curatorship. In realizing and verifying that there is a major collecting gap in the first place, in advocating and initiating the right kind of collecting program, and then after a series of technical processes, finally offering access and interpretation. Fundamentally, these kinds of collections are there to allow future generations to make use of not just individual items, but associations between them. This could not happen if that macro approach had not taken place in the first place. In a paradoxical way, macro curatorship creates the continuing possibility of a traditional curatorship of the future. It's distinctly peculiar to be talking about curatorship of the future in this building and in this auditorium or its twin, when in fact it has a strong personal association for me. I was a librarian in the round reading room here when the British Library operated in that space in the 1990s. On one occasion, I went along to a lunchtime reading in, I think, not this auditorium, this is brand new, it's a twin. And who was reading? It was a man I'd known for 4 or 5 years and who would be my most cherished correspondent and mentor for another 20 years. The poet Edwin Morgan. He gave a stunning and sometimes shocking reading from his play of Gilgamesh, which is based on the epic. I won't give the game away here. I invite you to read trepidatiously his version. The epic itself, at 4,000 years old, is the oldest work of literature there is. It was preserved in the ancient language of Akkadian on clay tablets in the library of AHRC, if that's how you say it, who knows? We should have that in the Sound Archive. There are examples of those tablets here. AHRC was a macro curator too. His library collected correspondence, legal texts, lists of people and animals and merchandise, a vast amount of scientific information, and myths and legends. Edwin Morgan had a complex relationship to library and archives. In one of his most important sequences from the video box, the first 3 poems are devoted to the burning of libraries, including the modern-day British Library. The sequence was written years before the library existed. It's a gleeful act of simultaneous creation and destruction. Yet these visionary poems are framed pointedly within a new kind of curated archive, one in which members of the public themselves testify to what they see, not only giving factual accounts, but giving their gloss on the events which unfold before them. They speak with acknowledged and unacknowledged bias, with enthusiasm and with expertise. They are, in other words, curators themselves. They are remarkably free. They love laughter, they understand democratic fundamentals, and they know how important it is to acknowledge the sublime. These are not concepts in opposition to each other. Importantly, they only have a certain tolerance for power and are very sensitive to heritage being used to maintain a ruling class. In the first poem, misuse of that power will mean, at a last resort, carrying out a very serious threat, warming the hands of the homeless on the embers of manuscripts. Looking back, my own research and curatorial work and my own poetry has tended to improvise that balance between the personal and the social, the individual and the collective. I should reassure colleagues here that I don't quite have the revolutionary fervour that Edwin Morgan had, but I have something of his curiosity and representational zeal. I found this could be a curatorial principle when I embarked with fellow librarian and poet David Miller on a 10-year initiative publishing its results as the monograph British Poetry Magazines 1914 to 2000. The project, which was more than the book itself, surveyed collections of 20th century poetry magazines across the UK, targeting acquisition of the gaps found. Through the creation effectively of a rich data set, our methodology brought to light various buried forms of literary relationship, regional, personal, and so on. Well, I'll end with a quotation from, in some ways, one of the so-called solitaries. Literature is sometimes seen as a solitary pursuit, but what our survey showed was that it was nothing of the kind. And that solitary is Edwin Morgan again. In an interview, he was asked why his work so often gives voice to the voiceless. In fact, even inanimate objects have a voice in Morgan. And he replied, yes, nothing not giving messages. Nothing not giving messages. It's an energizing and an anxious-making thought that so much is capable of communication. What curatorship shouldn't forget is that curatorship itself, we are also one of those story makers. And the relationship between subject and object is changing, shifting, dissolving. It's bewildering at times, but it's also exciting. Nothing not giving messages.
Good evening, my name is Hilary and I am a curator of war photography. And after that confessional beginning, I will explain how I got there. I've been with the Imperial War Museum for 35 years now, and like many of my generation who became involved in photography, I fell into it almost by accident. I set out thinking I would do one thing, and lo and behold, I ended up doing something else. As a student, as an undergraduate, I was very, very fortunate to study modern European history through the broadest range of modern media that was on offer. This, in the 1970s, was pretty exceptional. I was able to address aspects of history through art, philosophy, film, television, sound, and so on and so forth, which many of my contemporaries were unable to do. And it therefore was perhaps not too unexpected that I should end up in the museum world, but it was certainly unexpected that I should end up as a curator of photography with no formal training in photography per se, not being a photographer either. And that is one of the points I would like to make, which is that photography and many media are actually quite young. For me, the attraction of photography was its accessibility, its ubiquity, its ability to communicate quickly, to evoke an emotional response, to convey information. But the profession at that point that I joined the Imperial War Museum was still very, very young. Beaumont Newhall had just about invented the term, and I was privileged to effectively become part of the second generation of curators of photography. Since then, I have worked with curators all around the world. Curators of photography are united by their love of the medium and completely divided by their interpretation of the word curator. You have curators who are working independently. You have curators of national collections, curators of commercial collections, curators who disagree violently with the definition of a photograph as a visual image and see it as a finished print, or others who see it as a negative. And whenever we all get together in a room, it's enormously entertaining. So it leaves me to wonder what we mean by the term curatorship. And there are many, many possibilities, many, many answers. But for me personally, I see curatorship as a bridge between an artifact and the people. Now, those people can be very, very diverse, very varied in their approach to whatever subject you're dealing with. The Imperial War Museum has a very mixed audience. It's a multi-site museum, therefore the audience that attends each branch, the one up in Salford, the Churchill War Rooms, IWM London, the visitors all come for different reasons, and the demographic is very different. And so one of the challenges as a curator at the Imperial War Museum is to deal with a very diverse audience and respond appropriately. Another challenge within the context of the Imperial War Museum that we all face, but in the context of photography, perhaps particularly so, is the requirement to respond to contemporary events. When I joined the museum in 1980, the subject matter, the research that was ongoing, the audiences were particularly focused on the story of the two world wars. 2 years later, the Falklands conflict happened, and for me personally, that was the point at which history leapt off the page and became a real experience. Since then, I have worked with photographers around the world through a fairly distressing number of conflicts. And I would say during my entire career, there has been no year at all when British forces have not deployed on operations. There has also been no year in which there has been no conflict going on in the world. So it is very much an issue resolving around how do you collect as events unfold, how do you respond to those events in a way which is meaningful for the future, particularly when you don't actually know the full story. As anybody who has tried to make sense of some of the recent events in the Middle East will know, it's almost impossible because you don't have the full picture, and therefore the challenges for a curator or who dealing with contemporary events are enormous. You have to be, I would argue, extremely self-aware, but you also have to be extremely well aware of your actual and your potential audience. And I would also argue that in the present decade, technology, digital technology, communications technology has lowered those barriers considerably, so that your ability to communicate and the decisions that you make can be flashed around the world in a very short period of time, and they can have implications which you need to be very mindful of. So for any curator who is caught up in collecting the contemporary, and particularly contemporary events revolving around conflict, there is a certain responsibility that you need to bear in mind. You are indeed a bridge and a conduit, but you are not perfect, and you have to be honest about what the limitations and constraints may be. So the Imperial War Museum has expanded its photography collection from 5 million images when I joined to nearly 12 million today. During that time, we have seen professional photography move from primarily black and white to colour to digital. In each case, for the curators, the textbook was not there to be read. We had to write it. That is one of the enormous privileges of being a curator in certainly the photography world, but also in dealing with contemporary artifacts. I can remember writing once to NASA to actually try and get their advice on how to preserve the digital. And they responded with an absolutely incomprehensible diagram, which, when they translated it into normal English, made perfect sense and was actually something that if I'd sat down and thought about it, I would probably have come up with myself. But it just gives you a sense of some of the dilemmas that you're involved with. So a curator, what is a curator? Today, photographers curate their own collections. I have come across somebody who claimed that they were curating their garden and proposing to open it to the public, which, you could get that point. What is the term curator? I think I would offer that it is a content specialist with a love and ability to research, but also an ability to manage and also to communicate. And if you've got that element, plus a sense of humour, plus some decent imagination, I think you will survive as a curator no matter what organisation you might be in. And I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. My name's Kieran Long. I'm keeper of I nearly said my old job title, which I'll tell you about, but I'm keeper of the Department of Design, Architecture and Digital at the Victoria and Albert Museum. I've been there for just 2.5 years, so I'm probably by far the least experienced person on this panel, so forgive me my definite sort of innocence and sometimes naivety in some of the comments I'm about to make. I have some slides. I wonder if they might come on. But first of all, I'm going to tell you a little, first of all, about me and then an anecdote from this week that we're working on, speaking of curating the now in contemporary design. My background is mainly as a journalist and critic, mainly in the field of architecture. I worked for architecture magazines and edited them, and I was an architecture critic for the Evening Standard. So not just architecture, but this city of London. And it seemed to me in that period of my writing about London changing and the city moving and changing, that the public realm was at the very least unclear and at stake and very possibly under threat. When I started at the museum, The riots on our streets were not so distant in our memory. Libraries were closing. There was a sense that the public realm was under threat. And I, for the first time in my career, joined a public institution and began to ask, what are the responsibilities of a contemporary public institution? I'll come back to that point perhaps in a second. But back to objects. And what I'm going to show you are a bunch of things that we haven't collected, things that we have collected. And first, a thing I don't even have a picture of because we're in the throes of it. On Sunday, any sports fans here? Sports fans? Cycling fans? On Sunday, you may know Bradley Wiggins broke the world record for the furthest distance cycled in 1 hour. He did it at the Olympic Velodrome. And he cycled 54.5 kilometers in an hour, an astonishing cardiovascular feat. In the week following, this week in The Telegraph, the previous record holder, Alex Dowsett, gave some quotes saying he was skeptical about this record because Wiggins had used illegal equipment. And the illegal equipment in question was a pair of handlebars. Which he said were illegal in the rules of this record. And the rules, or one of the lesser-known rules of this record, were that to have a valid 1 hour record, you have to be riding a production bicycle, i.e. a bicycle that you could buy, theoretically speaking, a very expensive bicycle, but nonetheless you could theoretically buy it. And he said this is not a production bicycle because the handlebars that were made to Bradley Wiggins' specific specifications and for the length of his forearm and so on. They were 3D printed to his precise body shape. And so he said this is an illegal thing. Anyway, we got very excited at this moment, or rather my colleague Corinna Gardner, our curator of contemporary product design, came to me thrilled and excited because this is one of those moments where contemporary curators at the V&A get really excited. This is a moment of design and manufacturing being at the very heart of a front page story in the news. So she called up a company called Metron Advanced Equipment, which is a small boutique manufacturer in Nottingham, who made not just the handlebars, but the forks and the saddle stem for the bike that Wiggins broke the record on. And he has explained, I just got the email today, why this is actually manufactured product. They might all be unique, but they are produced in batches. And the nature of manufacturing today is that you can manufacture every single one of that batch of 25 handlebars as a unique object. They may be unique, but they're still manufactured. This is amazing for us, amazing for the V&A, which records the history of manufacturing, because in Bradley Wiggins' bike is a moment where manufacturing, the meaning of the word manufacturing has forever changed. It no longer means mass production. It no longer means producing the same thing in a series. It means producing lots of different things in a series. So this is the kind of story we get excited about. This is the kind of collecting we get excited about, and we hope to get a pair of those handlebars in a case at the V&A next week. Please come and see it. It's also a story about bewilderingly advanced manufacturing techniques, which are difficult to explain to the public. It's about high-performance industrial design and its consequences, and that is also something that can be difficult to explain to the browsing public, and, as I say, alerts us to changes in the world in a thrilling way. And we love the public debates that design and how design and designed objects give us access to those public debates. Coming back to how I opened, it seems to me that museums' biggest responsibility in the context of the at-stakeness of the public realm is to be is to defend the quality of knowledge in the public realm and take our own role seriously as a part of the public realm. And I hope this is something we can come to in the debate. But I sometimes say, well, if the public realm consists at one end, the Palace of Westminster, talking in a British context or London context, Palace of Westminster or Westminster Abbey, if you're so inclined, and at the other end, a public toilet. The museum is somewhere on that sliding scale, and the question we must ask ourselves is where, and what bandwidth of that scale does it embrace? What new duties might we have in a time of declining and at stake public realm? And I often say that I'm not so much interested in teaching our visitors about design and architecture as I am in teaching them about the world through design and architecture. So to come back to objects again, I'm going to show you really quickly in the couple of minutes that I have remaining, perhaps some of the yeses and nos that you were talking about before, Richard, that we've made recently. So 7 objects we would love to have collected but didn't, and 6 that we have. So and I'm just going to tell you, the ones we didn't collect, I'm just going to tell you what they are. And if you're interested, we can come to why we didn't collect them, but suffice to say we didn't. This is the first image. My wife is Swedish. I spent a lot of time in Stockholm. This is a piece of graffiti in Stockholm, 2 graffiti tags, one saying HTML, the other one in a different pen saying Flash. This is a diorama from the Creation Museum in Connecticut, a museum dedicated to the tenets of creationism and telling the story of the biblical, biblical creation. And this is a diorama where a little cave girl sits next to a dinosaur in order to sort of propose that these two things may have existed at the same time. You can visit this museum right now. This is an artwork by an artist called Aaron Barthold. Who here is on LinkedIn? Anyone on LinkedIn? Most people must be in LinkedIn. So if you are in LinkedIn and you haven't changed your password for the last 4 or 5 years, then it's in this book. This is Aaron Barthold's artwork where he printed all of the leaked passwords of every user on LinkedIn in I think it's 8 books in alphabetical order. This is a cruise ship cabin on a Royal Caribbean cruise ship with a view of the setting sun over presumably a wonderful sea somewhere in the Caribbean. But what's interesting about this cruise ship cabin is that it is inboard. It doesn't have a window. That is a live feed from a camera of the real-time sunset to your bedroom. So they're cheaper because you've got a TV screen with the sunset on it, not a porthole. This is a woman at the Sochi Olympics trying to take a picture of an event, but holding the camera around the wrong way and taking an extreme close-up of her own eye, being recorded by Russian state TV and broadcast to the world. This is Narendra Modi appearing as a hologram in a political rally in India during his successful bid to become the Prime Minister of India. He appeared in 37 different locations simultaneously and gave the same speech as a hologram. British company made this hologram. We wanted to acquire one. I'll tell you very briefly why we didn't, because they're really expensive. And they can only ever be Narendra Modi. So you spend £37,000 on a hologram that's always Narendra Modi, so we decided not to. And I think finally on the ones we didn't collect, two mobile phone masts, one disguised as a palm tree with a kind of red light on top to stop planes crashing into it. And you can sort of see from this tree that it's not really the right ecology of tree somehow. They always seem to make the wrong tree choice. They do come in a range of tree options. So now to 6 we have collected. And this, I'll tell you a little bit more in detail about this and then go quickly through the others if I have time. This is a pair of Katy Perry branded eyelashes under a brand called AHRC in Cool Kitty style. There are 3 styles to choose from. There are more now. There were only 3 when we acquired these. These are a pair of false eyelashes you could buy in Boots right now on Oxford Street. If you want to, $6.99, go and do it. So we collaborated with an investigative journalist on this acquisition who investigated the supply chain of the brand AHRC to a place in Java and Indonesia, which has one of the lowest legal minimum wages in the world. Now, there's no implication that AHRC don't pay that minimum wage, but this is an extremely low-wage economy in this part of Indonesia, where women hand make each of these eyelashes by sewing individual human hairs onto pieces of string with a specially designed needle. It's an incredibly skilled job. These are even so on the back of this box. It says handmade as a kind of quality of the product. Of course, some of these women, after they've been working on this for a certain number of years, no longer have eyesight good enough to do it anymore. And the allegations made by our collaborator on this go much further than we are legally confident in talking about here. But what's interesting about this thing for us is that this is a story of globalization. How do you collect an object that tells you about global supply chains, a world of infinite complexity? One of the things that started some of this collecting for us was the Rana Plaza disaster in Dhaka, the textiles manufacturing factory that collapsed, killing over 1,000 people. And when that happened, every piece of writing I read about it was about a system of incredible complexity, whether it was Bangladeshi building codes, whether it was the rights and responsibilities of consumers, of global capitalism, of the supply chain itself, how that was broken down, all things that even I, as a person deeply interested in these things, found difficult to hold in my head at once. But somehow showing these objects, showing the jeans as we did, a pair of trousers made in that factory, or these eyelashes, give us a way into these systems of seemingly infinite complexity, and we've had tremendous response to that. But what's interesting about Ayla is it's also a kind of really V&A kind of story. Ayla was a brand started by two bachelor brothers who came back from Hollywood after designing the makeup for people like Elizabeth Taylor and set up the first commercial manufacturing facility of false eyelashes, and they were a luxury product, and they built a very beautiful modernist factory in Wales to produce these things. So there is a whole British manufacturing history to this object. In lots of ways, this object kind of vibrates with V&A-ness, but also kind of globalization and its various consequences. I'll go a bit faster through some others because I'm running low on time. This is the Motorola WT4000 terminal. If you've ever bought anything online from Tesco's or from Amazon or anything like that, probably somebody wearing either this device or one very similar to it fulfilled your order. And we acquired this a few weeks after the Telegraph revealed that Tesco's had been firing workers because they were taking too many toilet breaks. They knew they were taking too many toilet breaks because this has GPS in it, and they knew exactly where they were in the factory. And that sounds pretty harsh to me. Some of our acquisitions are sort of straightforward industrial design innovation acquisitions. This is the Oculus Rift virtual reality headset, soon to come to all of your living rooms, or possibly soon to be the kind of Betamax of tomorrow, and we can't possibly know, but we took the decision to acquire it now. Other colleagues in the V&A might argue that we perhaps should have waited, and I leave that to the debate. A very authentic V&A acquisition in one way, which is 5 pairs of Christian Louboutin shoes. We have shoes just opened at the V&A, extraordinary collection of shoes, one of the great collections in the world of shoes. But these Christian Louboutin were the first luxury brand to have nude shoes in 5 different skin tones. So you will know if you've been watching the gossip pages that nude shoes have been very trendy for the last 4 or 5 years, but nude always meant Caucasian. This was Louboutin were the first brand to make a range of skin tones. There's an app with which you photograph your own skin, and it tells you how close your closest tone in this range. And we also acquired the display system, which is the weird thing of arms holding shoes. The reason for that is because in one of their major markets in the Middle East, it's taboo to show the unclothed leg, but not to show the unclothed forearm. So this is a kind of story of new luxury markets, of globalization of luxury, of the fact that the West and America and Europe do not anymore dominate the markets for these extraordinary brands. The Lego Academics, I'm sure this room knows about the Lego Academics. Not only is this the first Lego set depicting an all-female professional group, but it was also a crowdsourced design proposed by a female academic, spawning lots of hilarious Twitter feeds. Have you ever seen the Twitter feed, Lego Academics? You have to check it out. Acting out the frustrations of academic life through Lego. It's a great thing. And perhaps just very quickly, finally, the 3D printed gun. This was one of my early projects that I worked on at the museum, and one that really did raise a whole range of issues around digital collecting, around collecting a rather sinister object. This is a gun that you may have heard about this object. A guy in a Texan, perhaps unsurprisingly, law student, designed the world's first fully functioning 3D printed gun that can fire live ammunition. And it's an extraordinary feat of industrial design, but he then released those drawings online, and they were downloaded all over the world about 250,000 times before the Department of Tobacco Firearms in the US forced him to take them down. We've acquired the first ever fired prototype, and we printed this. This is one that we printed ourselves in London. This is a very long story, a fascinating acquisition, but bears on this question of digital collecting. And just very finally, what we think is interesting about these acquisitions is they have really provoked a public debate about objects that perhaps some museum colleagues might find sort of ephemeral or at least marginal to the kind of core collecting of an institution like the V&A. But we are really struck by how seriously they've been taken out in the world, and headlines like this in major newspapers, of course, make us feel like we're somehow doing our job. I'm sure there's lots more to say in the debate, so I'll draw it to an end there, but thank you for listening.
I'll just check whether I have a microphone. I do. Thank you very much to all our speakers. We heard from Nick that forgetting is important for memory institutions. Good news, as he says, for those of us getting older. That we should be interpreting the world, not trying to represent it anymore. We heard from Richard the challenges of the vast digital forest and how we need to ask that forest, what are you? I am totally intrigued by this process. And we also heard via Richard from the wonderful Edwin Morgan, nothing not giving messages. Then Hilary described to us curatorship as a bridge between an artifact and a person with people. And she reminded us, I don't know why she had to, that curators are not perfect, and that what we all need are a sense of humour, imagination, and ability to communicate. And finally, Kieran told us of the pleasure of curators being alerted to changes in the world and being part of the public debate of the world. So I hope you agree we've had incredibly stimulating presentations from everyone. We're not running entirely to time, so I'm going to make sure that there is enough time for questions, both from the panellists to each other, but also questions from the floor. I've also been given a duty that if I leave it to the end, I'll forget to do it. So I just want to welcome particularly all our CDA and CDP students that are with us today. That's Collaborative Doctoral Awards, Collaborative Doctoral Partnerships, for those of you not up on your acronyms. We've got a good number of the students that are attached to the IROs with us today, and they're organising their own conference called What It's Worth, The Value and Potential of the CDA. That's going to be here in this lecture theatre on the 27th of July, and it's going to be a free event exploring the origins, innovations and legacies of the CDA scheme as part of the 10th anniversary of AHRC. And get yourself on Eventbrite and you can register. So there you go, so I don't forget you. So one of the questions we posed earlier was, how will we be judged for our choices as curators? Would any of the panellists like to tackle that one?
I think the simple fact is we've got no idea, because of course one of the facts of life is that we can't predict the future, which is why really I was pushing the idea that we have to take responsibility for the decisions that we make in collecting in a contemporary context, understanding that people in the future will view it as we view collecting of 100 years ago, as partial and subjective. And I think we just need to embrace that as a natural part of it, the collecting process, rather than sometimes seeing it's a problem. You know, there might be some gaps, or people might judge us harshly in the future. We just have, it means judgment and expertise is absolutely crucial. And we've had some very good examples of a curator is somebody who really is authoritative and knows both the objects or the photographs and so on as in and of themselves, but particularly the wider social context, so that they can make judgments about what is important to them at that time and what isn't. And we have to be selective.
I would completely agree with that. What I would also say is that sometimes the curator is not entirely independent. In my own institution, we are also an archive of deposit. In other words, the imagery generated by the armed forces come to us under the Public Records Act. And some of the selection is done externally. And so what is terribly important at that point is that, as far as possible, one works with those making the decisions to understand their mindset and record it. I would sort of add that documenting the rationale behind your decisions is very, very important. Sometimes collecting decisions are informed by hard-nosed economics, you know, money, collecting costs money. And sometimes that is the sort of thing which tends to get forgotten when one is reviewing the curatorial and the collecting decisions of the past. I would suggest that today, maybe, the requirement of standards to have acquisition policies which are regularly reviewed is a good step forward to making collecting decisions perhaps sort of more systematized, but obviously there is the question of individual judgment and how one balances policy versus one's own instinct and experience and knowledge as a curator.
I'm sort of interested in a little bit pushing you a bit harder on this idea of authoritative subjectivity somehow being the position of the curator. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is difficult for young people, say, coming to curatorship. Becoming a curator is quite hard because to become authoritative, you have to wait a long time. People don't think you're authoritative for years, possibly decades. And I've come in from the side, and perhaps with a borrowed authority from another field. But where I started my career was in journalism, and I was 20 years old. And there was a standard called accuracy, and one might want to question whether the press is in general that accurate, but there was a standard of accuracy that one aspired to, and even as a 20-year-old, you could achieve. And if you achieved that standard, you were as authoritative as the editor. I find it hard to find where that value is that we can share in common across generations of curators in curatorial practice, where, you know, if it's just subjective authority, all these young people on the collaborative doctoral program have to wait another 15 years. And that doesn't seem right, and I wonder whether there's another value, another kind of measure that we could apply more broadly to curatorial practice.
I think that if I can just respond quickly, I think I wasn't talking necessarily about traditional curatorship in terms of the long apprenticeship before you can pass judgment. The most authoritative people I know on certain subjects are my children. You know, anything to do with computer games or contemporary culture, I don't know anything. They're the authority. And so I think if we're documenting, say, contemporary society, we need to have multiple voices who are selected for their authority around a particular theme. And sometimes, if you're in an institutional context, you need to borrow some of that authority, if you don't have it yourself, by bringing in people and collaborating with them who do have that. So it's not an apprentice model, but it's about immersion, really.
I think a lot of our judging is based on frameworks and momentum which have been set in place decades ago. So in a sense, a curator is often improvising within, if you like, a kind of base that's been given to them and was given to the people that's given it to them. One of the things that I'm very interested in is, okay, we've got all these institutions. Most of them, one way or another, have been around for a long time. And that means that all that heritage momentum is doing pretty much the same thing. Where's the gaps? Where, if we started all over again, where would be the big judgment? Is there some category that we really have totally missed? In that sense of curatorship, of getting it and passing it back to the public. And I'm talking about a new kind of institution. One of the things, because of the way government and the way the institutions themselves work, is it's always, well, this institution should be collecting this, that institution should be collecting that. But what about new kinds of things? I'm particularly concerned about video games. Now, some of the institutions collect those a little, a very little. But video games have been one of the great creativity success stories of the last 30 years. Now you could say everything's going to be fine. The corporates who now produce those, they are definitely going to secure that data. They're already pastiching things from 20, 30 years ago. So maybe it's okay in terms of the actual items, but maybe it's not okay in terms of the public enjoyment, celebration, understanding of that history. And you could say, well, British Library or maybe Manchester should do something about that. I don't think so. I think sometimes there should be something which is so big, so huge, that we as a community have to say, look, we've got to take an initiative over this. There needs to be a new kind of organization for this stuff. I think video games is an example of that. And there may be others. What do you think? Is there something you think, whoa, this is something that's been part of my life, and I don't see the institutions really majoring on that?
I would suggest that one of the challenges is collecting websites. Yes.
If we do that.
Well, we're doing video games.
But, I mean, there have been, and still are, various projects and initiatives involved in collecting those websites, but there are so many imponderables to manage. In my own field, the still image is now transforming itself into multimedia pieces where you have images with a sound commentary in a video format. And it breaks down the traditional disciplines, and you have to reassess not only your skills base, whether you've actually got the knowledge and the research and the resources to manage the collection and collect responsibly, but also sort of how you're going to link this in with your previous collections. The challenges produced by new media over the last 10, 15 years are extraordinary. No sooner have you got your head around one form of technology, and video games is a classic example, than, it's obsolete and you've gone on to the next. As a curator, one's racing to play catch-up. That's one of the challenges, I would suggest.
Can I just say one thing about video games? Because we are working on video games, but one of the interesting tasks I have at the moment is writing a brief for a new museum in East London. The V&A is building a new museum in East London at the Olympic Park, and one of the things we're striving to do there is to say, how do you make a gallery that doesn't have a distinct professional group or medium attached to it, but can accommodate the breadth of what digital practice might be, and that can be architecture or video games or digital art or music making, but somehow resist curating it to the extent that it can be appropriated by new disciplines that we can't name. And it's a real challenge, because when people say what's going to be in it and you say, I don't know yet, that's not very convincing, but somehow we're trying to hang on to some of that.
Sorry, I do want to open this up to the floor. We have 2 roving mics. If you could say who you are and then either tell us what we should be collecting, or probably more importantly, ask our panel some questions. Stick your hand up. Yes, sir? Right here.
Thank you very much. Matthew Sheldon. I've come up from Portsmouth today, from the National Museum of the Royal Navy. It's very interesting I think we've heard a lot about people's professional interests and background and authority. Nobody's posed the question, actually, are we individually the best people to be collecting? Are we the people who actually understand the significance of an activity or a culture? And could perhaps people just comment on how we might use others to collect for us, and actually use other people's understanding and think of actually where that is better than our own?
Anyone want to take this one up?
I mean, very briefly, I mentioned in the context of the eyelashes, I think, maybe as a journalist I'm prejudiced, but I think, for instance, investigative journalists, the few that are still out there in the world, are sort of some of our best access. I mean, I'm sure that you also work probably far more deeply than we do, but we've found those collaborations amazing. We would never have collected those eyelashes and done it as seriously as we did without the help of a journalist. So I totally agree, but it's hard to pay them. It's hard to think about how to sort of, value their knowledge and make the kind of professional thing work. But I think the will is there from us in any case.
I think one of the big issues is that some of the most interesting areas are ones that arouse passions in people. And sometimes the best people to be involved in the collecting are the individuals themselves. But then what do you collect? And I think we're still focused around museums acquiring objects. We've talked a lot about digital, and there's this kind of penumbra around the object of lots of digital information and so on. But I wonder whether we ought to be thinking more about not collecting, but borrowing, and having museum collections that are more transitory. I mean, setting aside all the practicalities and of managing all of that, but in an ideal world, sometimes people don't want to give up objects that are extremely important to them, but often their stories are ones that we want to tell. So it might be that we have a much more fluid approach to collections in the future, however that might be managed.
I think that could also apply to the collections we've already got. We can be more of a lender than we are at the moment. Mm-hmm. You cross the piazza of the British Library, you're basically crossing 4 double basements of many, many beautiful objects, book objects, that will sit there for many, many, many years and not be looked at. Is there a way of federating that out, or maybe even object by object. A single object can be so interesting to a community, and a community is sometimes created around the lending of a single object. So I think there's more to be done among the museums and galleries and libraries about what we already have. So it's not, again, about choosing to bring stuff in, it's choosing about how we get that sharing out.
Okay, can we take another question? The gentleman in the white shirt.
Can you? Okay. Hello, I'm Miles O'Brien. I'm just a recent graduate archaeologist. How do you regulate subjectivity? And if so, if you think that subjectivity has been taken, how can you empirically test that?
I think the point of subjectivity is that you accept its subjective nature. In other words, you can't empirically test it or regulate it. I think it's about, as I said earlier, really having faith in a system whereby you bring on the people or include in the collecting process and the representational process people who have a sufficiently wide knowledge of the context in which they're operating to be able to deliver. So if you say you want to collect on the theme of climate change, then you've got people around you who are talking about a collecting programme that have enough perspectives on it to give you a reasonably rounded view. But it'll always be subjective.
I just suppose that probably that was the case going back into the 19th century when people were collecting, then that they were believing in their own views. You see what I mean? But that's just my opinion. Sorry.
What I would say to that is that the concept of an acquisitions policy, a collecting policy, which identifies priorities, is now in place amongst most national collections. It is a standard requirement, and that, I think, provides you, in terms of collecting, with the regulation that you require. The challenge is to balance individual judgment and that input, the enthusiasm of the individual collector, the knowledge of the individual curator, with the predefined policy, acquisitions policy. So you need to constantly review those policies and make sure that they are appropriate. And there needs to be, I won't say a frank exchange of views, but a productive and continuing ongoing discussion about collecting priorities. I would also add that the same applies to putting forward public programme projects, exhibitions, publications, and so forth. It's terribly easy to do what you might call a vanity project, an individual project, but the question is anybody going to take any interest in it apart from you? How do you do that? And so, again, there are policies and procedures. Marketing is a concept that I think curators struggle to get to grips with, even though they recognise the importance of it. But the point is to make sure that that the projects that you do has the desired effect. It achieves what you want it to achieve and that the institution wants it to achieve, and that it takes into consideration the broadest possible range of views, rather as well as those of the individual who is advocating it.
I would say that just in contrast, I mean, one of my most exciting moments of a week is like the heady moment where someone just decides. And when someone just decides, they just say, yeah, that's what we're doing. We're going to spend £1 million or £1 on that thing. And that kind of moment is one that some people are crippled by, but if you're not, especially at a place like the V&A, it can be tremendous, because when you buy a pair of Katy Perry eyelashes for the V&A, people care and they think about it and they put work into thinking about the implications of that decision. So I think, like, I don't know, I'm not really one for subjectivity, but at some point somebody just decides is the truth. I mean, for all the collecting plans in the world.
I mean, there is definitely an element of that, but there is definitely a need for balance.
Thank you very much.
Another question? Any of the women in the audience like to speak? Thank you very much. In the middle here.
Thanks. My name's Danielle Tom. I'm an assistant curator at the V&A. The question I wanted to ask was about types of curatorial knowledge and getting a sense from everyone on the panel that we're thinking about collecting as a form of social documentation. And Kieran, you said that you're wanting to educate people about the world through design, as well as about design. And I think that's very valuable. I think that's important. But in doing that, are we potentially at risk of losing certain types of what might be seen as more traditional ways of looking at kind of connoisseurial narratives, ways of understanding about the object, about its materiality, its history, and so on? Or are we at a stage where we feel that we can move away from that more traditional model of curating?
I don't want it to just be a V&A question. I think somebody else should answer.
I think there's a lot to be said for beauty and pleasure and enjoyment. They might not be research things, probably the wrong place to say this, but beautiful objects are worth sharing. And maybe we need to think a bit more about that without ruining the beauty of something that you overthink.
This is the benefit of having a poet on the panel. Anyone else want to tackle that one? Okay, we had a gentleman up the back.
Hello, I'm Simon Wilmoth. I'm the Director of Research and Management at the University of the Arts London. I wonder if you could say something about your relationship to private and commercial collections and archives. That is, the curation that's going on outside of the museum and how that relates to the museum. And the other thing I wanted to say was, could you say something about, rather than curating the nation curating? You know, the idea of dispersed curation.
We did talk about this in the green room, so who would like to jump in?
Well, I can start with something on the nation curating, if that's helpful. And I think, to begin, I had some problems with the term curating the nation, because if we look at, there are not that many collecting institutions that collect just the nation. Even the national museums in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland have a global reach. So I think we probably need to spend some time teasing out not just what we mean by the nation in a time of devolution and so on, but also the fact that any collection is both in terms of where the objects have come from, usually global, but also in terms of, as Kieran was showing, objects that are acquired in the UK usually have some globally entangled network that leads to their production. So all collecting, I think, is beyond the nation. But to go back to the other issue, the nation curating, I think, is, if it was manageable, is kind of what we should be aiming for. We may be, in practical terms, having to work through proxies, such as inform people who have large networks that can sort of feel what the mood of the nation is and what the sort of key issues are abroad in the whatever country we're focusing on, or whatever boundaries we put around the nation. But I think that's key in moving from a 19th century disciplinary model where all of the power and authority and knowledge rested within the curator, to one where we say knowledge is dispersed and knowledge exists outside the academy and outside the museums in a way that, if it can be marshalled, can bring a much richer kind of perspective to whatever we collect. So I think the principle of it is a very good one, and many museums try to do that probably in a more local level. So the other thing we were talking about behind the scenes was that, in a way, maybe we shouldn't be thinking just about because I'm the token representative from the regions here, we shouldn't be just thinking about London-based sort of national institutions, but about the dispersed national collection. In other words, how we can mobilise all of the collections that exist in museums, libraries and archives and other institutions right across Great Britain, for example, in a way that can be thought of collectively and being used much more, which is why I very much support what Richard was saying about the national collections, particularly the London-based ones, being made available more nationally. And I know that that's something that's seen as a priority in the national institutions anyway.
I'd like to just add very quickly, the IWM has been undertaking a project which I could describe as the nation curating. It's using online technology. It's called The Lives of the Great War, and essentially the IWM has put together a framework which is, as far as possible, designed to be academically rigorous, but enabling individuals to engage with their own knowledge, do their own research, and contribute it. So this has been running since last year, and I think I've lost count of how many entries there are on it now, but it's already into the tens of thousands. So technology can indeed allow the nation to curate, but within, I would suggest and propose, a framework to make sure that you get the optimum results for all.
And I would propose the opposite of that, which is that the nation is already curating. It's called the internet, and the museums have to join in. So how much richer would the internet be if every every curator at the V&A every week edited a Wikipedia entry? It would have the most extraordinary impact on the quality of knowledge in the public realm around design, and we don't do it, and I don't know why, and we probably should. But I think the nation is already curating. It's called the web.
Okay, I'm afraid I'm going to have to draw it to a close there. Well, not entirely a close, because we want to invite you upstairs to have a drink with each other and with our panellists. And we definitely haven't finished this conversation, so I hope you will take part with us up there. Has anyone got anything they are desperate to ask before they get a drink? What a well-behaved audience.
Drink wins.
So if you can join me in thanking our panellists again for an extremely stimulating debate.